The last morning of harvest came in golden and merciless, and Etta Turner stood at the cookfire with her hands trembling around a cast iron skillet, knowing that when the sun hit the top of that ridge, everything she had built over the past 4 weeks would be gone. Louis Keating stood 10 feet away from her, hat in his hands, jaw set like stone, and the look in his dark eyes was the kind that a woman carries with her for the rest of her life, whether she wants to or not. Around them, 16 harvest hands moved with the low, heavy energy of men who had already said their goodbyes without saying a word. Nobody was rushing to load the wagons. Nobody was particularly interested in leaving. "Tell me it isn't true," Louis said. His voice was low and controlled, but she could hear the fracture underneath it like ice on a spring river. "Tell me you weren't planning to leave without a word." Etta pressed her lips together. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times over the past week. She had told herself it would be clean, professional. She had been hired to cook for the harvest season at the Keating Ranch outside of Abilene, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, and when the harvest ended, her contract ended. That was the nature of the arrangement. That was what she had signed her name to. She had not signed her name to falling in love with the man who owned the land. "I was hired for the harvest," she said, and hated how hollow it sounded, how it did not come close to touching the truth of the past 4 weeks. "The harvest is done," Louis said. "The wheat is cut, the bins are full, and you are standing here cooking breakfast for 16 men who are looking for any excuse to stay at this table one more hour, and you know why." She did know why. She just could not afford to say it out loud. From across the camp, a big, weathered hand named Clarence Hobbs, who had been with the Keating Ranch for 11 years, cleared his throat loudly and pretended to find something fascinating about the state of his boot. The other men suddenly became very occupied with their coffee cups and their plates in the distant horizon. "Etta," Louis said, and the way he said her name, not Mrs. Turner, not Miss Turner, just Etta, like she was something precious and breakable all at once, cracked the careful armor she had been constructing since 4 o'clock that morning. She set the skillet down. She turned around. And the story of how they had arrived at this moment on the last morning of harvest, on a golden Kansas morning in October of 1878, began to unspool in her chest like thread from a broken spool, all the way back to the beginning. 4 weeks earlier, Etta Turner had arrived in Abilene on the afternoon train from Wichita with $32 to her name, a single trunk of belongings, and a letter of employment that she had answered out of what felt very much like desperation. She was 26 years old. She had been a widow for 14 months, her husband Robert having died of pneumonia the previous winter, and leaving her with nothing but debts that his modest carpentry business had accumulated, and a boarding house landlady in Wichita who was not known for her patience or her charity. Etta had grown up cooking. Her mother had run a boarding house kitchen in Missouri, and Etta had learned at her mother's elbow everything there was to know about feeding large numbers of people quickly and well and without complaint, regardless of the conditions. When she had seen the advertisement in the Wichita Eagle, she had read it 3 times before allowing herself to feel any hope about it. A large wheat and cattle ranch outside Abilene was seeking an experienced cook for the harvest season, a period of roughly 4 to 6 weeks beginning in late September of 1878. Room and board were included. The pay was fair. The letter of application was to be sent to one Louis Keating, proprietor. She had written the letter that same evening. She had received a reply within the week, and she had packed her trunk with the efficiency of a woman who had nothing to lose and boarded the train west. Abilene in 1878 was a town that had already seen its most raucous years. The cattle drives from Texas that had turned it into a lawless, roaring boomtown through the early and mid part of the decade had largely been rerouted west as the farming frontier pushed further into Kansas, and the town had settled into something almost respectable, with a proper rail depot and several dry goods merchants and a hotel that had curtains in the windows. Etta stepped off the train into the warm smell of late September wheat dust and horse and prairie wind and felt, despite everything, a small and cautious stirring of something that might have been possibility. A man was waiting at the depot with a wagon, holding a sign with her name on it. He was not Louis Keating. He was an older ranch hand named Walt Purvis who introduced himself with a nod and not much else, took her trunk without ceremony, and helped her up onto the wagon bench with the practiced manners of a man who had been raised right but had not had occasion to use it much. The Keating Ranch was 12 miles southwest of town. Walt Purvis did not talk much on the drive, which suited Etta fine because she was too busy watching the land. The Kansas plains in late September were not beautiful the way mountains were beautiful or the way coastal scenery was beautiful. They were beautiful in the way that a long, honest silence is beautiful, enormous and unbroken, and full of a kind of demanding permanence. The wheat fields stretched in every direction, already heavy in gold, ready to give up what they had been building all summer. In the far distance, a line of cottonwoods followed a creek bed, and beyond that the sky went on until Etta lost interest in trying to find where it ended. The ranch itself was larger than she had expected. A main house built of weathered clapboard, solid and unpretentious, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. Behind it a bunkhouse, a cookhouse that sat separate from the main house, a large barn, 2 outbuildings, and a series of corrals where several horses watched the wagon arrive with polite disinterest. Beyond the buildings, the wheat fields ran to the horizon, and already she could hear the distant sounds of men and horses and machinery preparing for the work ahead. Walt pulled the wagon up beside the cookhouse and jumped down. "Mr. Keating said he'd be in from the fields by supper time," he said. "I'll show you where everything is." The cookhouse was better equipped than she had dared hope. A large cast iron range with 6 burners, a proper wood-burning oven, a long worktable of heavy pine, 2 full sets of dishes and cookware, a cold room dug into the back of the structure where the cold of the earth kept provisions reasonably cool, and a storeroom beside it that was stocked with sacks of flour, dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, coffee, sugar, and enough canned goods to provision a small army. There was a sleeping alcove partitioned off from the main kitchen space by a heavy curtain, barely large enough for a cot and a small washstand, but clean and private, and Etta felt the first genuine relief she had felt in months at the sight of it. She spent the afternoon taking inventory, familiarizing herself with the layout of the kitchen, stoking the range and gauging its particular temperament, because every stove had one. By the time the light outside began to deepen toward evening gold, she had a pot of beans with salt pork on the back burner, a pan of cornbread in the oven, and was beginning a large pot of coffee that would serve the men who were already beginning to drift in from the fields. She heard him before she saw him, not because he was loud. Louis Keating was not the kind of man who was loud. But there was a quality to the sound of his boots on the cookhouse step, something certain and unhurried, that made her turn from the stove before he even opened the door. He was 30 years old, though she would not learn that until later. He was tall and lean in the way that men who work physical land for years become lean, with broad shoulders and hands that bore the particular calluses of ranch work, and a face that had been shaped by weather and responsibility into something that was not conventionally handsome but was deeply compelling. His hair was dark, his eyes were darker, and he looked at her with an expression of frank, uncomplicated assessment that she found she did not mind. "Mrs. Turner," he said, and took his hat off. "Louis Keating, I apologize for not being here when you arrived." "No apology needed," she said. "Your man Walt got me settled. Supper will be ready within the half-hour." He glanced at the stove, at the organized state of the kitchen, at the coffee already steaming, and something in his expression shifted from assessment to something warmer. "Looks like you've been at it a while." "I don't know how to do it any other way," she said simply. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the exchange of information. Then he nodded. "I'll let the men know. Thank you, Mrs. Turner." She watched him go and told herself quite firmly that she noticed nothing beyond the practical. But she noticed. She noticed quite a lot. The first week of harvest was pure organized chaos, and Etta was exactly in her element in a way she had not been in a very long time. The crew swelled to 16 men as additional harvest hands arrived in the first 2 days, men who came in from across the county and from as far as Missouri, following the harvest the way birds follow seasons. They were a mixed collection of humanity, ranging from veterans of the trail drives of earlier in the decade to young men barely old enough to have beards, weathered farmers working other men's harvests to supplement their own income, a pair of brothers from a Mennonite settlement to the north who spoke careful, accented English and worked harder than anyone else on the crew. Feeding them was a significant undertaking. Etta rose at 4:30 every morning to start the fires and the coffee. Breakfast was served at 5:30, a full hot meal of eggs when they were available, salt pork or side bacon, fried potatoes, biscuits, and coffee in quantities that would stagger a lesser woman. The men ate lunch in shifts in the field, which meant she spent the morning preparing meals that could be wrapped and transported to wherever they were working. Supper was the major meal of the day, served at 7, after the work was done and the tools were put away. And she pulled out everything she knew for those evening meals because men who have worked from before sunrise to past sunset deserve to sit down to something that makes them feel like human beings again. She made beef stew that simmered all day until the meat fell apart, and sourdough bread she started the night before. She made chicken and dumplings on the days when Louis's neighbor Mrs. Hargrove sent over a crate of birds. She made a wild plum preserve she found in the cold room into a sauce for pork chops that had the men genuinely speechless for the first several bites. She experimented with the pie crust she made from the lard in the storeroom until she got the ratio exactly right, and the apple pies she sent out on the 5th day of harvest caused a normally taciturn man named Hector Domings to press his hat to his chest and say something reverent in Spanish. Louis ate with the men every evening. He took no special privilege at the table, sat where there was room, passed the dishes without being asked. But Etta was aware, in the particular way a woman becomes aware of things she does not particularly intend to be aware of, that his eyes found her more often than the simple oversight of the meal required. Not in a manner that made her uncomfortable. In a manner that was almost worse, because it was honest and attentive and warm, and she had not had those things directed at her in a long, long time. On the 6th evening, after the men had dispersed to the bunkhouse and she was cleaning up the cookhouse, she heard the step on the porch again, and Louis appeared in the doorway with a dish in each hand. "Thought you might let me help," he said. She stared at him. "Mr. Keating, that is not necessary." "I know it isn't necessary," he said, and set the dishes down on the work table with the matter-of-fact air of a man who had made up his mind. "But the men have been talking about your cooking since day one and nobody's offered to help you with the washing up, which strikes me as poor manners. Where's the wash basin?" she pointed, mostly because she couldn't think of a reason not to. They washed dishes together in the lantern light, not talking very much, just existing in the same warm kitchen space with the sound of prairie wind outside and the horses settling in the corral, and Etta was aware of a treacherous, specific kind of comfort that she had not felt since long before Robert died and that she was absolutely not prepared for. "You've done this before," he said, "cooking for a large crew." "My mother ran a boarding house in Missouri," she said. "I was cooking for 12 to 15 people by the time I was 14. Where in Missouri? Outside of Liberty, you know it." "I came through there once years ago," he said, "on my way west, good country." "Yes," she said, "it was." The past tense sat between them for a moment, carrying the weight of everything that had changed for both of them, though she didn't know his story yet and he didn't know hers. "What brought you to Kansas?" he asked. She kept her eyes on the dish in her hands. "My husband passed last winter. I needed work." She kept her voice neutral and practical because that was the only way she knew how to talk about it yet. The advertisement seemed like a good fit. He was quiet for a moment, "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said and meant it and moved on. "What about you? The ranch has been here a while," he nodded. "My father started it in '68. I came out in '69, just after I turned 21. He passed in '72 and I've been running it since." She looked at him then, because there was something in the way he said it that was perfectly controlled and perfectly final, the voice of a man who has also had to learn to carry loss without making it the first thing people see. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, echoing his own words back to him, and he looked at her and something shifted, quick and significant between them. "Thank you," he said. The second week of harvest brought a cold front down from the north that had the men working in heavy coats and the frost coming in across the fields at night. Etta adapted without complaint, adding more warming foods to the rotation: hot oatmeal with molasses and dried fruit in the mornings, thicker soups and stews, more bread. She also found that the cold front brought a particular exhaustion with it, because working in cold air is harder on the body than working in warmth, and men who are deeply tired are not always as pleasant to deal with. There was a disagreement on the 9th day of harvest, the kind that blew up fast and hot between two men who had been working the same section of field and had developed a profound mutual irritation. Etta was at the cookhouse when she heard it escalate outside, two voices rising in the sharp, ugly way of men who have gotten past the point of reason. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Louis was already out there. He had come from the barn at a walk, unhurried, but with an authority in his movement that the two men registered before he had said a word. He put himself between them with the calm precision of a man who has broken up more than one of these before, and he talked to both of them, quietly, for what felt like a long time, and when it was over they both went back to work with the chastened manner of men who have been handled well. Etta watched from the cookhouse doorway, and felt something deepen in the awareness she had been carefully not paying attention to. He came to help with the dishes again that evening, and the evening after, and after the third night, it was simply something that happened without either of them acknowledging that it had become a pattern. They talked more as the days passed, the kind of talking that happens when two people are doing a practical thing together, and the guardrails of formal conversation gradually fall away. He told her about his first years on the ranch, about the particular terror and exhilaration of being solely responsible for a piece of land and a group of men at 23. She told him about her mother's kitchen in Missouri, about the years she had spent there before marrying Robert and moving to Wichita, about the pleasure she had always taken in cooking that was more than just a practical skill, was something closer to an art form she had been given. "You cook like you mean it," he said one evening, in a way that was not a compliment so much as an observation, the kind of observation that lands differently than a compliment because it is more precise. She thought about that. "I think I always cooked for the people I was feeding," she said. "My mother used to say that a woman who cooks like she means it is saying something that she can't find other words for." He held her gaze. "What are you saying?" She looked away, suddenly and acutely aware of the warmth of the kitchen, the closeness of the space, the fact that they were alone. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. The second week became the third week, and the wheat harvest gave way to the secondary work of mending fences, cleaning equipment, preparing the root cellar and the grain bins for winter storage. And Etta found that the rhythms of the work had become deeply familiar to her, that she knew the men by their appetites and their preferences and their moods now, knew that Clarence Hobbs always needed a second cup of coffee before he was fit for human company in the mornings, knew that the Mennonite brothers Eli and Jonas Layman were partial to anything with caraway seeds in it, and that she had made them both a little homesick with a caraway rye bread she had produced on a whim, knew that young Billy Carmichael, who could not have been older than 19, was trying very hard to be a grown man among older hands, and that a little extra respect in the serving of his food went a long way toward that dignity. She also knew, by the beginning of the third week, that she was in serious trouble where Louis Keating was concerned, and she had not the faintest idea what to do about it. It was not just the evenings, though the evenings were the heart of it. It was the way he would find occasion to come by the cookhouse during the day, sometimes with a practical reason, a question about supplies or a note that one of the men had a food intolerance she should know about, and sometimes with no reason at all except that he had clearly been passing and thought to stop. It was the way he noticed when she was tired and ensured, without making a production of it, that she had access to what she needed. It was the day she ran short of wood for the range and found it replenished before she had a chance to ask. And when she mentioned it to Walt, he simply said, with the subtle expression of a man delivering information he finds faintly amusing, that Mr. Keating had seen to it himself. It was the conversation they had on a Tuesday afternoon at the end of the second week, when the whole crew had ridden out to fix a stretch of fence on the south pasture, and Etta had the rare gift of a quiet afternoon, and she had taken her mending outside to sit on the cookhouse steps in the thin autumn sunlight. Louis had come back from the fence line early, something about needing to check the records in the house, and he had seen her there, and instead of going inside he had sat down on the step below hers, forearms on his knees, and they had talked for 2 solid hours. He talked about what he intended for the ranch, about the additional land he had been quietly purchasing to the north over the past 3 years, about the cattle operation he was building alongside the wheat because he believed a diversified operation was more resilient than a single crop one, and his understanding of it was deep and considered, and she found it genuinely interesting because she had grown up around farming, and she knew the particular intelligence it required. She asked questions and he answered them fully and asked her questions in return, and the afternoon went on in that way, golden and unhurried, until the sound of the crew coming back broke the spell. He stood and looked at her, and she looked up at him, and the quality of that look was something she lay awake with for a long time that night. The trouble came in the middle of the third week, and it came from a direction she had not anticipated. A woman arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning, driving her own buggy with a confidence that suggested she did so regularly. She was perhaps 35, handsome and well-dressed in the standards of western Kansas in 1878, with the particular manner of a woman who is accustomed to a certain social position and intends to maintain it. Her name was Catherine Aldrich, and she was the widow of the late Harold Aldrich, who had owned the largest dry goods operation in Abilene before his death 2 years prior, and had left his widow in very comfortable circumstances. Etta was in the cookhouse when she arrived. She did not mean to overhear the conversation that took place on the front porch of the main house, but sound carries in the open air, and the cookhouse windows faced the front yard. "Louis," Catherine Aldrich said, with a warmth that was not entirely social, "I came to see how the harvest is going, and to remind you that the garrison dinner is Saturday week. I told Elizabeth you would escort me." "I hadn't agreed to that," Louis said, and his voice was carefully pleasant. "Oh, you didn't disagree either," Catherine said and laughed, and the laugh was not unpleasant, but it was certain. "Everybody expects you to be there, and it does seem silly for us to go separately when we live on the same road." "I'll think about it," Louis said. "Would you like some coffee?" The conversation moved inside. Etta kept her attention on the bread dough she was working, pressing her knuckles into it with perhaps slightly more force than the dough strictly required. She told herself that what she had heard was nothing. She told herself that Louis Keating's social life was absolutely not her concern. She told herself that Catherine Aldrich was a respectable woman in respectable circumstances, and that she herself was a hired cook who would be leaving when the harvest ended. She told herself all of these things several times during the morning, and none of them succeeded in touching the cold, specific feeling that had settled in the center of her chest. That evening, Louis did not come to help with the dishes. She told herself she was relieved. She was not relieved. She was almost angry at herself for noticing his absence, which was entirely irrational, because he owed her nothing and she had no claim on his time or his attention, and she knew better than to have let things come this far in the first place. He came to the cookhouse the next morning at 6, before breakfast, when she was alone. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with a directness that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he was serious about. "I want to explain about Catherine Aldrich," he said. "You don't owe me any explanation," she said, not turning from the stove. "No," he agreed, "but I want to offer one anyway." He came further into the kitchen and stopped at the work table, where she could feel him looking at her profile. "Catherine is the widow of a neighbor. She is a kind woman and a respectable one. She has made it clear over the past year that she would not be opposed to a change in her circumstances that involved me. I have never encouraged it. I have never discouraged it as plainly as I probably should have, and that is my failing." Etta kept her hands on the skillet handle and said nothing. "I am telling you this," he said, "because I think you heard enough yesterday to make a conclusion that I don't want you to make." She turned then because she could not turn. She looked at him. "What conclusion is that?" she asked, and her voice was steadier than she felt. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, the kind of moment that has a weight to it that takes up physical space in a room. "That I am not entirely free," he said. "I want you to know that I am entirely free, Etta, that there is nothing and no one holding a claim on me that I have put there myself." She held his gaze. The cast iron skillet was very hot in her hand. "I'm a hired cook," she said, not because she believed it disposed of anything, but because she felt she had to say it. "I know what you are," he said, "and I know what the end of the harvest means for the arrangement we came to. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm just asking you to know where I stand." He left. She stood at the stove for a full minute before she remembered the bacon. She thought about his words all day. She thought about what it meant that he had come to tell her, that he had used her given name in that sentence, that the look in his eyes when he said he was entirely free had been both honest and something else, something careful and hopeful, that she had to be careful not to read too much into because she was 26 years old and a widow and a hired cook, and the harvest was going to end. But she also thought about what her mother had told her once, on a winter evening in the Missouri boarding house kitchen, about the particular foolishness of a woman who lets fear convince her that she is being practical. "You can call it caution all you like," her mother had said, "but if you're keeping yourself from something real because you're afraid of what happens if it ends, then you're not being cautious. You're being a coward." Etta Turner was a great many things, but she had never been a coward. The third week passed into the fourth, and the harvest work entered its final phase, the bins filling, the tallies being done, the equipment being cleaned and put away for another year. There was a particular quality to the final days of harvest, something elegiac and celebratory in equal measure, and it was present in the Keating Ranch that year in a way that felt charged with something extra, something that Etta suspected the men were aware of even if they never would have put words to it. The evenings around the supper table became longer. The men lingered over their food in a way they hadn't at the beginning of the season, when there was so much work ahead that the urgency of rest chased them from the table. Now they sat and talked and asked for second helpings that were sometimes more about the sitting than the eating, and Etta fed them and listened to their stories and felt a fullness in her chest that was not entirely about the satisfaction of the work. On the 22nd day of harvest, Etta made a meal that she knew was something more than sustenance. She had been planning it in her head for several days, pulling together every skill she had and every resource in the cold room and the storeroom, because something in her understood that this was not just a meal, that it was a statement, that she was saying with food what she had not yet found the exact words to say. She made a roast of beef that she had been marinating for 2 days in a bath of red wine vinegar, dried herbs from the small bundle she kept in her trunk, garlic from the string Walt had brought back from town, and a little sugar that turned the crust of the roast into something deeply complex and aromatic. She made roasted root vegetables with butter and fresh thyme. She made a sourdough loaf with seeds on the top that she had been saving for a special occasion. She made a chocolate cake from a recipe her mother had given her, and that she had committed to memory in her early teens, using the dark cocoa powder and the brown sugar and the strong coffee that went into the batter and made it something extraordinary. When the men sat down to that supper, there was a silence that lasted a full 10 seconds before anyone reached for anything, the kind of silence that is not awkwardness but reverence. Clarence Hobbs said, "Lord have mercy," and that seemed to express the general sentiment adequately. Louis sat at the table and looked at the food and then looked at Etta, who was standing at the side of the room in the manner of a cook who has delivered her best work and is both proud and quietly terrified of it. And the look he gave her was everything she had been trying not to acknowledge for 3 weeks compressed into one moment. After the meal, after the men had drifted out with the stunned, grateful expressions of people who have been fed not just food but care, Louis stayed behind. He did not immediately start helping with the dishes. He stood at the work table and watched her begin the cleanup, and she could feel the weight of what he was about to say before he said it. "Etta," he said, "how many days are left on your contract?" She kept her hands busy. "5," she said, "6 if we count today. And then I go back to Wichita," she said. The word Wichita tasted like a lie even as she said it because she had nothing in Wichita to go back to, nothing concrete that she was returning for. But it was the direction that pointed away from here, and she said it because she needed to say something. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "To go back to Wichita?" She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression so open and honest that it almost hurt, because Louis Keating was not a man who opened himself up like that casually. She had learned that about him over 4 weeks of evenings in this kitchen, and the fact that he was doing it now meant that the stakes had gotten very high. "What I want," she said carefully, "and what is reasonable are not always the same thing." "I'm asking about what you want," he said, "not what is reasonable." She held his gaze for a long time. The lantern light was warm, and the kitchen smelled like chocolate cake and roasted meat, and the particular lived-in scent of a kitchen that has been worked hard and well, and she thought about fear and caution and her mother's voice and 5 days in Wichita. "I want to stay," she said, and said it quietly but said it. He came around the work table and stood close to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to maintain eye contact, and he looked at her with an expression that was serious and tender and absolutely certain, the expression of a man who has waited long enough. "Then stay," he said. "You're talking about more than the contract," she said. "I'm talking about more than the contract," he confirmed. "Louis," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like something she had been holding very carefully for a long time and was only now allowing to breathe. "This is fast." "I know it is," he said. "I know what I'm asking, and I know it's fast, and I know you've got reasons to be careful. I've got reasons to be careful too. But I also know that the past 4 weeks have been the best 4 weeks this ranch has seen in a long time, and it's not the cooking. It's you." "You know it's you." She did know. She had known for a while now. The knowing of it was both terrifying and the most substantial thing she had felt since long before Robert died, maybe since long before Robert at all. "I need a little more time," she said. "Not to decide. I've already decided, but to settle with the decision. Can you give me the rest of the week?" He looked at her, and the patience in his eyes was extraordinary, the patience of a man who has learned to take care of a piece of land that only gives back what it is given, and only on its own schedule. "I can give you whatever time you need," he said. He picked up a dish towel and helped her with the dishes, and neither of them said anything more about it that evening. But everything between them was different in the way that things are different once the truth has been spoken out loud. The remaining days of harvest were not the days that either of them had expected. Etta worked with a particular intensity during those final days, not because she was trying to prove something or because she thought the work needed more from her, but because she understood now with absolute clarity what this place and these people and this season had come to mean to her, and she was not going to leave the last days unlived. She taught Billy Carmichael, who had mentioned shyly one morning that he wanted to learn to cook something better than what came out of a can, how to make a proper beef stew, standing beside him at the stove and talking him through the stages of it, and the pride on his young face when the men ate it and said it was good, was one of the genuinely sweet things she had seen in a long time. She spent one afternoon with Eli and Jonah's layman, who had brought seeds with them at the beginning of the season, with the intention of getting them traded, and had somehow not managed to find the right person to do so. And she told them about the miller in town who she had heard from Walt was looking for specialty grains, and helped them write the letter to him in the careful, precise English they requested, because they were embarrassed about their spelling. And the genuine warmth with which both men thanked her was something she would carry with her. She and Louis rode out to the north field on the fourth-to-last evening, not because there was any particular reason to go, but because he had asked her if she would like to see the land he had been acquiring to the north, and she had said yes. They rode out in the long slant of late afternoon light, she on the older mare named Patience that Walt had assured her was entirely steady and reliable, he on the big bay gelding he rode every day. They rode mostly in comfortable silence, which was something she had come to value greatly about Louis. The fact that silence with him was never uncomfortable but felt like another form of talking. The land opened up around them, enormous and golden in the autumn light, and she understood what he had described when he talked about his reasons for expanding the operation, could see the resilience in it, the wisdom of a man who had been watching this country long enough to understand what it needed. They stopped on a low rise that looked back over the whole of the ranch, the buildings small in the distance, the fields surrounding them in patchwork gold and brown, the late light turning everything amber. "What do you see?" she asked him. He was quiet for a moment, looking out. "Everything I've worked for," he said, "and everything I still want to build." He turned his head and looked at her. That list has gotten longer in the past few weeks. She felt the warmth of that move through her chest. She held his gaze. "What's been added to it?" "A proper kitchen in the main house," he said, with the careful, specific tone of a man who is saying something that means a great deal more than the individual words. "The cookhouse was always meant to be temporary. I've been thinking about expanding the main house east. There's enough room. The kitchen could be twice this size, with proper light." She understood that he was not talking about construction. She understood that he was inviting her into the future. He was describing in the careful language of a man who respects a woman's right to hear the practical shape of what is being offered before she has to decide how she feels about it. "That sounds like a considerable project," she said. "It is," he agreed, "but worth doing right." They rode back in the amber dusk, and that evening she could not sleep for a long time, lying in her cot in the alcove behind the curtain, listening to the prairie wind and the settling of the cookhouse timbers, and thinking about kitchens and choices, and everything her mother had ever told her about not being a coward. On the penultimate day of harvest, a letter arrived for her from Wichita. It was from her landlady, a Mrs. Fitch, who wrote in the terse, vaguely accusatory style that was natural to her to inform Etta that she had been letting her room on a temporary basis, and that if Etta intended to return to Wichita, she would need to confirm the date of her arrival as soon as possible, or she could not guarantee the room would be available. Etta read the letter twice. Then she put it in the stove. The decision she had already made settled in her bones with the definitive weight of something final. That evening, she made the best supper of the entire season, which was saying something. She had been saving back resources for days, planning it out. She made a full roasted chicken for each end of the table, golden-skinned and fragrant with sage and garlic, alongside roasted sweet potatoes from the last of the ones that had been brought up from the root cellar, and a cranberry relish she had made from the dried cranberries in the storeroom, and some of the cider vinegar that gave it a brightness that cut perfectly through the richness of the chicken. She made 2 kinds of bread, the sourdough loaf and a honey-glazed corn bread that she had been perfecting over the whole season. She made a dried apple pie with a crust so flaky it scattered at the touch of a fork, and a second pie of sweet potato with molasses and cinnamon that was a recipe she had invented herself. The men sat down to that table and understood, without being told, that something was ending and being honored simultaneously. The meal had the quality of a ceremony. Nobody rushed. Nobody reached first. They waited for her to bring the last dish to the table, and when she did, Clarence Hobbs, who was not a sentimental man in any ordinary sense, stood up. And one by one, every man at the table stood up, and they stood there for a moment in the lamplight, these 16 men who had come together for a season and been fed by this woman. And the respect in that standing was something Etta had to look away from because it affected her deeply. "To Mrs. Turner," Clarence said, raising his coffee cup. "The best cook any of us have ever had the privilege of eating a meal prepared by." The chorus of agreement around the table was genuine and unanimous, and considerably noisier than anything these men had previously produced collectively. Etta laughed, and the laugh had something close to tears in it, though she managed to maintain enough composure to thank them properly. Louis looked at her from across the table, and his eyes said everything that the public moment wouldn't allow him to say. After the meal, after the men had gone, she was alone in the cookhouse when she heard the step on the porch that she now knew by heart. She did not turn from the dishes when he came in. She heard him pick up a dish towel. "You don't have to do that tonight," she said. "I know," he said. They worked in silence for a while, and the silence was full of the weight of everything unsaid, all the conversations that had been held carefully in the margins of practical things, and she knew that tonight the margins were going to have to give way to the center. "I burned Mrs. Fitch's letter," she said. She heard the pause in his movements. "Mrs. Fitch, my landlady in Wichita. She was asking if I was coming back." She kept her eyes on the dish in her hands. "I don't think I'm going back to Wichita." "No." His voice was very carefully controlled, but she had been listening to Louis Keating's voice for 4 weeks, and she could hear everything in it. "No," she said. She turned to look at him. "I think I've been running a cookhouse on behalf of someone else's house for long enough. I think I'd like to cook in my own kitchen." He set down the dish towel. He looked at her with the particular expression she associated with him making a decision that was not impulsive but had been arrived at by the most careful and thorough consideration possible, which was simply how Louis Keating arrived at everything that mattered. "Etta Turner," he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to hear it as a serious question and not a hasty one." "I know you don't do things hastily," she said. "I've been thinking about this since the 2nd week of harvest," he said. "In case that's relevant to the seriousness of the question," he held her gaze. "Will you stay, not as a cook, as my wife, as the person who builds this place with me? Because I have looked at this land every day for 9 years, and the shape of what I want it to be, what I want my life here to be, has come into focus in these 4 weeks in a way it never has before, and that is because of you. That is entirely because of you." She stood very still. She looked at him, this careful, honest, quietly extraordinary man standing in the warm lamplight of the cookhouse she had lived in for 4 weeks, with a dish towel in his hand and everything open in his eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Louis." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, his work-roughened hands so impossibly careful with her, and kissed her. And the kiss was everything the past 4 weeks had been building toward, warm and certain and deeply, completely real. And that was where they were. That was how they had arrived at the last morning of harvest, when Etta stood at the cook-fire with her hands trembling around the cast iron skillet, and Louis stood 10 feet away looking at her like she was something he had been afraid would slip through his fingers, because she had been preparing to leave without resolving the one remaining practical question that hung between them, and he had seen it in her face at breakfast, and he had to say something about it. The remaining practical question was this. She had told him yes 3 nights ago. He had held her hands, and they had talked until very late, making real and detailed plans for what the future looked like. And everything they had said matched in a way that felt like 2 pieces of the same puzzle fitting together with no force required. But in the morning light, with the last day of harvest unfolding and the men loading wagons and the practical machinery of ending in motion all around her, She had been seized by a sudden and paralyzing terror that she had not told him the truth of her circumstances, the full truth, the thing she had been carrying quietly. She owed Robert Turner nothing, exactly. He had been a decent man and not an unkind one, but she had married him at 22 for practical reasons that had felt like love at the time, and had eventually settled into something more honest about itself, which was that they had been two people who were fond of each other and shared a household, and had been very lonely in the same house for years before he died. She had grieved him. She had grieved him properly. But the secret she had not told Louis, the hidden piece of herself she had been protecting, was that she was terrified, profoundly and specifically terrified, that she did not know how to trust what she felt for him because she had already once mistaken practicality for love, and she could not afford to do that again, could not afford to enter into a marriage and a life on this ranch, and then discover that she had made the same mistake twice. That was what was in her face when he said her name that last morning. That was the fracture underneath the last day of harvest. "Tell me it isn't true," Louis said. "Tell me you weren't planning to leave without a word." She set the skillet down. She turned around. She looked at him, and 16 men at the breakfast table behind her were performing a masterful collective act of studied inattention. "I was planning to tell you something," she said. "I was working out how." He came toward her, closing the distance between them steadily, and stopped 2 feet away. "Tell me now," he said. She took a breath. "I married Robert Turner because I was 22 and I needed someone, and I thought what I felt was love, and I am not certain I knew the difference," she said. "And I am standing here on the last morning of a harvest season having told you yes 3 nights ago, and I am terrified that I am making the same mistake in the opposite direction. Terrified that what I feel for you is so real to me that it has convinced me I know what I'm doing, and what if I don't? What if I get it wrong again?" He listened to all of it. He did not move. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she could hear the prairie wind and the far sounds of the harvest world ending around them, and she was aware that she had just handed him the most vulnerable thing she possessed. "Do you know what I did before I asked you to stay?" he said. She shook her head. "I sat at the desk in the study for 2 hours and I thought about every reason not to ask you," he said. "I've been running this ranch for 9 years alone, and being alone is something I know how to do, and there is a particular safety in what you know how to do. I thought about all the ways it could go wrong. I thought about the fact that we've known each other for less than 4 weeks, and that any reasonable person looking in from the outside would call that reckless." He took the last step between them and took both her hands in his, right there in front of 16 men who were all staring fixedly at their breakfast plates. "And then I thought about every evening in that cookhouse," he said, "and every conversation and every moment of watching you work, watching you take care of the people around you with a generosity that is not performed but is simply the nature of who you are. And I thought about you on horseback in the late afternoon light looking out over my land and asking me what I see, as if you already understood that what I see matters to you. And I thought that the specific quality of fear I'm feeling right now, this fear that you'll say no, is the opposite of the fear you're talking about. The fear of losing something real is the proof of it." She looked at him. Her hands were warm inside his. Around them, the last morning of harvest held its breath. "I'm not your first husband," he said. "I don't know what he was or wasn't to you. I just know what I am. I know what I feel, and I know it is not practical. There is nothing practical about the fact that a 4-week harvest season has become the most significant thing that has happened to me in my adult life. That is not practical. That is entirely, completely real." She looked at him for a long moment, and the terror was still present, but it was the honest kind now, the kind that accompanies all real things, and underneath it was something vast and solid and entirely unafraid of his eyes. "I know," she said. "I know it's real. That's what scared me." "I know," he said. "Are you still scared?" She thought about it genuinely. "Yes," she said, "but I'm not letting that make my decision for me." He smiled, and it was the fullest smile she had seen on his face in 4 weeks, the one he held back in ordinary moments and that she understood was reserved for things that warranted it, and it did something decisive to the inside of her chest. From across the camp, Clarence Hobbs cleared his throat again, then apparently gave up on pretending because he turned around on the bench and said, to no one in particular but in a voice everyone could hear, "About time." The laughter that rolled through the breakfast camp was genuine and warm, and Louis kept her hands in his, and Etta Turner laughed with the rest of them, and the last morning of harvest came in golden and impossible around them. The wedding was held 6 weeks later, on a clear cold morning in late November of 1878, in the First Methodist Church in Abilene, which was not a grand building but which was full. Louis Keating had spent 9 years building a life in that county, and the people of it turned out to honor that. The harvest hands who were local came, including Clarence Hobbs, who wore a coat that Etta suspected had not been out of a chest since a previous significant occasion. The Lehman brothers came, Eli and Jonas, and brought their whole extended family, including 3 sisters, all of whom greeted Etta with the warm, approving formality of people who have decided to adopt someone. Billy Carmichael came with his hat in his hands and a scrubbed face, and stood very straight and did his best to look like an adult at a ceremony, which was so earnest that Etta had to look away to keep her composure. Catherine Aldrich did not come, which Etta thought was the graceful choice, and for which she silently gave the woman credit. Etta wore a dress she had ordered from the milliner in Abilene, a deep burgundy wool that was simple and well-made and suited to the season, not a bride's white because she was a woman who had been married before, and she did not need the trappings of a first wedding to know that this was different in every meaningful way from the first one. She carried a small bunch of dried fall grasses tied with a ribbon that Eli Lehman's eldest sister had pressed into her hands that morning, telling her it was a tradition for brides in their community, and it would bring them a flourishing home. Etta thanked her and carried it and meant it. Louis looked at her when she came down the aisle with a look that she stored in the most permanent part of her memory, the kind of look that a woman can go back to in difficult moments for the rest of her life and draw from as a resource. It was not a look of surprise, because he had been expecting her. It was a look of a man seeing the future he had chosen walking toward him, and finding that the reality of it exceeded what he had been able to imagine. The ceremony was brief and honest and completely sufficient. The reception was held at the church hall with food that Etta had spent 2 days preparing with the assistance of several women from the congregation who had offered, and whom she had gratefully accepted, because she was learning, slowly and with some effort, that it was all right to let people do things for her. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the 2 of them in the wagon, with the last of the season's cold coming down across the plains. The ranch looked different to her as they came up the road to it, though nothing had changed in it. It was simply hers now, in the way that was both more than and entirely different from a temporary employment, and the feeling of that was so large that she could not quite fit the whole of it in her mind at once. He showed her the study that evening, the room in the house she had not yet properly seen, the room where the records of the ranch were kept, and where he had told her he had sat for 2 hours working up the courage to ask her to stay. It was a plain room with a large desk and bookshelves and a lamp that cast a good working light, and on the desk was the contract she had signed in Wichita, the 4 to 6 week cooking contract, folded and set under a small piece of petrified wood that served as a paperweight. "I kept it," he said. "I thought someday we might want to show it to someone." She picked up the contract and read it, and there was something both funny and tender about the plain language of it, the agreement to provide experienced cooking services for the harvest season at the Keating Ranch. She set it back down on the desk. "It's the most consequential document I've ever signed," she said. "That might be true for both of us," he said. The winter was long and extraordinary. Etta had never spent a Kansas winter on the open plains before, had never experienced the particular and total transformation of a landscape that goes from golden to white in what feels like an overnight. The wind that has nothing to slow it down for 100 miles and comes in under doors and around window frames with a determination that is almost personal. She had always been warm-natured, in the sense of generating heat both physical and otherwise, and the combination of her and Louis in that main house through that first winter was something that neither of them had language for, but that both of them felt as a kind of profound rightness. She took possession of the main house kitchen with the same focused efficiency she had brought to the cookhouse, organizing it to her particular understanding of workflow and accessibility. And the expansion that Louis had mentioned began in the spring, the east wall of the kitchen going out to allow for the larger space, and the additional windows he had promised her that would give her the light she needed. She was involved in the planning of it, and the contractor they brought from town found this initially surprising and subsequently quite useful, because she had precise ideas about what she needed and where it needed to be, and when it was done, the kitchen was exactly what she had imagined. Walt Purvis remained with the ranch through the winter and beyond, a constant and reliable presence who had adapted to Etta's arrival with the pragmatic acceptance of a man who respects competence and has no patience for pettiness. He brought her information about town and supplies without being asked to when he happened to be in Abilene, and this practical thoughtfulness was something Etta reciprocated by ensuring he always had a full meal waiting after a cold ride back. In the spring of 1879, Etta discovered she was expecting a child. She told Louis on a March evening when the plains were just beginning to show the tentative suggestion of green under the retreating snow, standing in the new kitchen that smelled of fresh pine and plaster, and the look on his face was something she knew immediately she would keep alongside the look he had given her coming down the aisle. He came to her and held her carefully as if she were both very precious and entirely capable of standing on her own, which she had come to understand was precisely how he understood her, and he said quietly into her hair, "Thank you." "You're thanking me," she said, half laughing. "For everything," he said. "For answering the advertisement, for getting on the train, for staying." "You talked me into staying," she reminded him. "No," he said, "you decided to stay. I just said what was true." Their son was born in November of 1879, a full, healthy boy who announced himself to the world with considerable volume, and sustained the volume for the first several months of his life in a way that Louis bore with the equanimity of a man accustomed to early mornings and unexpected difficulties. They named him Samuel Robert Keating, the Robert for Etta's first husband, which Louis suggested without prompting, because he understood that honoring the past honestly is not a threat to the present, and that gesture was one of the many things that Etta returned to as evidence of who Louis Keating actually was. The harvest of 1879 was larger than the harvest of 1878, because the north acreage Louis had been acquiring was now in full production, and the crew was 20 men rather than 16. Etta cooked for the harvest again, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because the rhythm of feeding a large crew through the intense labor of a harvest season was something she had discovered she genuinely loved as a form of work, and because there was a particular pleasure in being both the ranch owner's wife and the person who took extraordinary care of the people working on the ranch, the combination of those roles giving her a position and a purpose that felt entirely her own. Billy Carmichael came back for the harvest of 1879, having spent the intervening year on another outfit to the west. He was a year older and noticeably more competent and considerably more at ease with himself, and he cooked his own contribution to one of the evening meals, a beef stew that was genuinely good, and the pride on his face when Etta told him so was worth everything. Clarence Hobbs was there, as immovable and reliable as the land itself. He had a way with Samuel that was entirely at odds with his ordinary manner, a patience and a gentleness that appeared specifically for the baby, and retired immediately when the baby was not present, and Etta found this endearing beyond description. The Lehman brothers had made contact with the miller in town through the letter she had helped them write, and the connection had led to a profitable arrangement for their specialty grains that had materially improved their situation. They came to tell her this in person at the beginning of the 1879 harvest, both of them formal and genuine in their gratitude, and Eli Lehman's eldest sister, whose name was Katharina, had become a friend of Etta's over the winter, visiting and exchanging recipes and practical knowledge in the way of women who recognize in each other a similar kind of intelligence and competence. Through 1880 and into 1881, the ranch continued to grow as Louis had always planned it. The cattle operation he had been building gained its footing in a serious way, and there were now always several men on the permanent payroll beyond the seasonal harvest crew, men who worked the cattle through the year and who became a settled community on the land in a way that the seasonal hands were not. Etta fed them all, not every meal for the whole operation as the operation grew, because that became impractical, but the major shared meals, the Sunday dinners that became a tradition, the celebrations, the holidays. Christmas of 1880 was 32 people sitting down to a meal in the main house, extended by the dining room that had also been added in the spring construction, and Etta cooked it all with the assistance of Katharina Lehman and a young woman named Pearl, who had arrived with one of the permanent hands as his new wife, and who was learning to cook with the focused, slightly anxious energy of a woman who takes being good at it seriously, and needed someone to show her she was already doing better than she thought. Louis and Etta had a second child in the spring of 1882, a daughter this time, born in April with a full head of dark hair and her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular expression of determined assessment. They named her Clara Jane Keating, the Jane for Etta's mother, and she was from the first day of her life entirely herself, which was perhaps the finest thing Etta could say about anyone. Samuel by this time was 2.5 and had opinions about everything, which Louis handled with the same patient authority he brought to the management of the ranch, meaning that he listened fully and then responded in a way that was clear and fair. And Samuel responded to this treatment by being a child who did not have to shout to be heard, and who therefore did not generally shout. Etta watched Louis with their children with a fullness in her chest that she had long since stopped being surprised by, but that she took care never to take for granted. In the summer of 1883, a drought came across the central Kansas plains. It was not the worst drought the region had ever seen, but it was serious enough, the kind that makes men who depend on the land understand in their bones exactly how precarious the arrangement with the earth always is. The wheat was significantly diminished that year. There was tension on the ranch and around it, the particular tight-jawed quiet of men who are watching their year's work contract under a rainless sky. Louis handled it without drama, implementing the measures that his diversified operation made available to him, the cattle side of the business cushioning what the crop side could not produce that year. But there were nights in the summer of 1883 when Etta lay awake beside him and felt his wakefulness beside her like a live thing, and she would reach for his hand in the dark and hold it, and sometimes he would say something and sometimes he would not, and both were all right. On a July evening that year, when the heat had broken enough to let the air out of the house without bringing in more heat, they sat on the front porch in the 2 chairs that had lived there since Louis first had the porch built, chairs that had a history of being sat in separately and were now sat in always together. Samuel was asleep in the house. Clara was asleep. The sound of the ranch at night was around them, horses and wind, and the far sound of the creek that was lower than it should have been. "Tell me something," Louis said, in the way he sometimes said it when he wanted her particular view on something that was living in his mind. "The rain comes when it comes," she said, because she understood what was in his mind without him needing to specify it. "And in between, you do everything a person can do, and you don't waste the dry years wishing they were wet." He was quiet for a moment. "You know, I've been working this land for 15 years and you've been on it for 5, and you understand it better than most people who have been here their whole lives." "I understand you," she said simply. "The land is yours. I understand you well enough to understand most of what you love." He turned his head and looked at her, and the look was the same one she catalogued in the most permanent part of herself, full and honest and entirely certain, and he lifted the hand that was holding hers and pressed it to his mouth and held it there for a moment. "I love you," he said directly and plainly, as he sometimes said it, not in the heightened moments but in the ordinary ones, as if he wanted her to have it in as many contexts as possible. "I love you," she said back, equally directly and plainly, because she had learned from him the practice of saying it plainly. The rains came in August, late but sufficient, enough to see the root crops through and to replenish the creek and to allow the following year to start on a reasonable footing. The harvest of 1883 was reduced but not catastrophic, and the ranch came through it intact, which was more than some operations in the county could say, and Louis was quietly grateful in the particular way he was grateful for things, which was to continue working as if nothing extraordinary had happened while making 1 or 2 private acknowledgments that something had. The harvest of 1884 was the best year the Keating Ranch had seen. The conditions cooperated, the acreage was fully productive. The cattle operation was now sufficiently established to be a significant commercial enterprise in its own right, and by the end of that season, the ranch had a financial position that put the future on genuinely solid ground. Etta cooked the harvest crew's meals that year with the same intention she brought to it every year, and the tradition of the extraordinary final supper had by then become something so established that men who had worked other harvests in between would remark on it as they sat down, not with any entitlement, but with the particular anticipation of something known and trusted. Clarence Hobbs had retired from field work by 1884, but he was not absent from the ranch, having taken on a role that was partly caretaking of the equipment and partly simply being there, a permanent fixture of the place in the way that certain things on a long-running enterprise become part of its character. He remained the most reliable and consistently gruff appreciator of Etta's cooking, which she had long since understood as the highest available form of praise from that particular source. Samuel was 5 by the autumn of 1884, and he had taken to following Walt Purvis around the ranch on the days when Walt was doing slow enough work to accommodate a 5-year-old's company, and Walt tolerated this with the stoic patience of a man who has no children of his own, and is not about to admit that he finds it anything but a tolerable inconvenience. Clara was 2, and in the active stage of applying her determined, assessor's nature to the full environment of the ranch and everyone in it. There was a running project to keep track of Clara, who had not yet internalized the concept of staying where she was put, and who consequently appeared in places she had not been left with a frequency that kept everyone moderately vigilant. In the winter of 1885, Etta discovered she was expecting again, and told Louis on a December evening by the study lamp with the snow coming down outside the window, and he looked at her with the same expression she had catalogued from the first time, the one that incorporated profound happiness and a specific quality of tenderness that she understood was reserved solely for moments involving her. Their third child, another son, was born in August of 1885 and named Henry Walt Keating, the Walt for the man who had driven her from the train station to the ranch on that first afternoon and had been part of the fabric of the place ever since. Walt Purvis received this information with complete outward composure and an emotion that the red in his ears entirely betrayed, and he did not mention it again for some time, but he was considerably attentive to Henry from his earliest days in the way that people sometimes are when they know a child carries something of their name. The years moved on in the way of years on working land, full of the particular combination of the repetitive and the extraordinary that is the nature of farming and ranching life. The seasons had their rhythms and their variations, and Etta had come to understand both in her bones, in a way she had not possessed before that first train ride to Abilene in the autumn of 1878. She knew the light of every season on these plains now, knew the way the spring came tentative, and then sudden, and then enormous, knew the summer's particular quality of heat, and the way it made the distant horizon shimmer in the late afternoon, knew the autumn gold that had been the first thing she had seen on that first afternoon on the wagon with Walt Purvis, the color that she associated with the beginning of everything. In 1888, Abilene held a harvest fair, a formal civic celebration of the agricultural life of the county, and the organizing committee came to Etta, by then established as one of the most respected women in the farming community around the town, and asked if she would oversee the food arrangements for the communal harvest dinner. She said yes with the efficiency of a woman who knows what she is capable of and has stopped pretending otherwise, and assembled a group of women from across the county, including Katharina Lehman and Pearl, who had become a genuinely skilled cook, and several others, and they produced a dinner for 200 people that was the subject of conversation in the county for the rest of that year. Louis came and found her after that dinner, with the particular expression of pride that he wore specifically in relation to her, and she accepted it with the understanding that it was honest, and that there was nothing diminishing in being loved by a man who finds what you do worth admiring. 10 years after the last morning of harvest in 1878, in October of 1888, Etta stood in the kitchen of the Keating Ranch on a morning not unlike that one, golden light coming through the windows she had been promised and had built, and had cooked by for nearly a decade. 3 children making the particular noises of children being gotten ready for a day in another part of the house. And she thought about the woman who had arrived at the Abilene train station with $32 and a single trunk, and a letter of employment that she had answered out of something very close to desperation. That woman had been brave, she thought, in the ways that mattered, had gotten on the train, had answered the advertisement, had stayed. She heard footsteps in the hall, the specific cadence of them, and the kitchen door opened, and Louis came in for his morning coffee in the manner that he had come in for morning coffee in that kitchen for nearly a decade, and he looked at her across the kitchen with the expression that she had catalogued in the most permanent part of herself, the one that she knew she would be able to go back to for the rest of her life and find unchanged. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He came to her at the stove and kissed her temple and poured his coffee, and she stood beside him in the warm kitchen with the light coming in at the eastern windows, and the sounds of the ranch coming up around the house, horses and wind, and the particular life of a place that had been built carefully and was continuing to grow. And she felt, deep in her bones, the settled and permanent truth of what she had made and what had made her and what they were making together. Outside, Samuel's voice rose somewhere near the barn, directing Clara with the particular authority of an older brother that Clara received with the particular disregard of a younger sister, who has her own understanding of things. And Henry, who was 3, and moved through the world with a focused energy that kept his parents in a constant low-grade readiness, was presumably somewhere between the house and the barn doing something that would require gentle correction. Louis heard it all with the practiced ear of a man who knows his territory. "I'll get them sorted," he said, and took his coffee and his hat from the hook and went out, and Etta listened to the familiar sound of his boots on the porch and then down the steps and then across the yard, and she went back to the stove where breakfast was waiting to be finished, and the morning came in golden all around her, and the season that had begun a decade ago on a September afternoon on the train from Wichita, was still not over, and she had no wish for it to end. The Keating Ranch continued to grow in the years that followed. By the early 1890s, the wheat and cattle operation was one of the more substantial in central Kansas, and the main house had expanded twice beyond its original footprint, each addition managed with the same careful intention Louis brought to everything, designed with Etta's full involvement at every stage. The kitchen remained her particular domain, always the center of the household in the way that well-used kitchens are, smelling of bread and coffee and whatever was on the stove, bearing the honorable evidence of sustained, serious cooking in its every surface and tool. Samuel grew into a young man with his father's calm and his mother's practical intelligence, and by the time he was 15, he was working the ranch with the genuine competence of someone who has been learning by close example his entire life. Clara remained entirely herself, which meant she was negotiating the particular challenges of the 1890s frontier as a young woman with opinions with the combination of her mother's determination and her father's strategic patience, both of which she had in full measure. Henry, the youngest, was a person of great enthusiasms who attached himself to things with a total commitment that was sometimes exhausting and always impressive, and who had by the age of 8 decided that the cattle side of the ranch was his specific interest, and pursued this declaration with a thoroughness that made Louis quietly very happy. Louis himself was in his 40s by the time the decade turned, still lean and steady, still running the ranch with the hands-on commitment that had always been his way, though he had more help now and had learned slowly to let capable people do capable things without standing over them. He had a few more lines around his eyes, and his hair had begun to show the first gray at the temples, and Etta found him no less compelling at 40 than she had at 30, which she suspected was partly because the lines and the gray were evidence of the life they had built, and that evidence seemed to her entirely worth admiring. She was 38 in 1890, and had the particular quality of a woman who has been genuinely well used and well loved, who knows who she is and what she is capable of, and has been able to express both in full for the better part of a decade. She had never entirely left the role of cook, because cooking was not a role for her but a way of understanding the world, and the meals she continued to produce for the ranch during harvest seasons, and for the Sunday dinners, and for the Abilene Harvest Fair that had become an annual institution, were understood in the county as something worth coming to, something worth marking the occasion of. On an evening in October of 1890, exactly 12 years after the last morning of the harvest that had changed everything, Etta and Louis sat on the front porch in the chairs that had always been there. With the autumn dusk coming down over the plains in the same amber gold it always came down in, and Samuel was in the barn doing the last of the evening work, and Clara was inside reading by the lamp with the focused intensity she brought to everything. And Henry was asleep early because he had been up at 4 in the morning to see a calf born, and the day had caught up with him. 12 years, Louis said. Since you asked me to stay, she said. Since you said yes, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon in the way he sometimes looked at it, the full and serious attention of a man taking stock of what is in front of him, and then he turned and looked at her with the expression she carried in the most permanent catalogue of her heart. I want you to know something, he said. Tell me, she said. Every single year of those 12, he said, I have thought about the last morning of that harvest, the way you looked standing at the cook fair, the way you said you didn't know what was reasonable, the way it felt when you said you wanted to stay. He paused. Every harvest since then, when the season ends, I think about that morning. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the plains and the distant sound of Samuel finishing in the barn and the particular quality of his voice in the saying of it. What do you think about it? She asked. That I almost lost it, he said. That you almost got on the train back to Wichita and taken everything with you, and I might have let you, out of caution, out of not wanting to presume. You didn't let me, she said. No, he said. I didn't. She reached over and took his hand on the armrest of the chair beside hers, and he folded his fingers around hers in the way that had become one of the most ordinary and most significant gestures in her life. And they sat on the porch in the autumn dusk together, and the ranch breathed around them, and the season that had begun a decade and more ago on a September afternoon on a train from Wichita went on without any visible end. It went on in the years that followed, in the accumulated texture of a life on working land with a man who knew the difference between what was said and what was meant, who had learned alongside her and from her, and she alongside him and from him, who had built something real and lasting with her because they had both, at the critical moment, refused to let fear be the final word. It went on in the harvest suppers that the men talked about all year in anticipation, in the expanding table of the Sunday dinners that came to include not just the permanent ranch hands but families from the neighboring farms, the Lehman families represented by Eli and Jonas themselves, and their wives and children, the broader community of people who had come to understand the Keating table as a place where you would be fed with intention and welcomed without ceremony. It went on in the kitchen Louis had built her, the one with the eastern windows and the twice-expanded footprint, where she had cooked 10,000 meals and taught several young women to cook and developed several dozen recipes that had no source but her own particular understanding of flavor and nourishment and the specific pleasures of a meal made with full attention. It went on in the 3 children who grew into themselves on that land, Samuel steady and capable, Clara brilliantly herself, Henry consumed by a love of the cattle operation that showed no sign of moderating as he grew older, and that Louis watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man seeing the work of his life confirmed. It went on in the contract folded under the piece of petrified wood on the study desk, the document that had started everything, that Louis occasionally took out and read, with the expression of a man who finds the plainness of the language amusing and the significance of it inexhaustible. It went on, permanent and daily and full, the way things go on when they have been started honestly and tended to with care. And every year when the harvest season came in golden across the plains of Kansas, Etta Turner Keating stood in the kitchen with the eastern light coming through the windows, and the smell of the wheat came through the door on the same prairie wind that had been there since the first afternoon, and she felt in her bones what she had known since the last morning of that first harvest. That some seasons, if you are very careful and very brave and very willing to say the true thing out loud, do not end. They simply become the rest of your life.